Hello, everyone. Good evening to all of you. I can see quite a number of known faces as well, and I'm happy to be on this platform to speak something about wildlife, which I normally am passionate about. What I'm going to do is I will try and make this as much as a layperson's talk because everybody is interested in nature. Everyone loves to go around uh, looking at flora, fauna during your nature trails, bird watching sessions, and so on. The problem is that even I started like that when I started 42 years ago, is we all start with taxonomy. We all start naming birds, naming animals, naming insects, naming trees, plants, and so on. But your observation, your intensity, your involvement in wildlife would be more fruitful, will be more rewarding if you start looking at other aspects of wildlife. And when initially I used to go around with Dr. Salim Ali, Humayun Abdul Ali, J.C. Daniel, Robert Grubb, and so many other people, they used to ask me sometimes, oh, what is this bird? What is this animal? Because they had gone well beyond just identifying birds and animals. And that's where I used to wonder that what is happening? Why have they forgotten the names of these animals and plants? And now when I see myself as a full-fledged zoology professor, as a full-fledged person who loves to go into wildlife and to look at not just an individual, but everything about an individual, that's when I realized that there are so many things that one can look at. And one of the things that one should look at is animal behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you so that I can share some of the points of my talk today with you. My approach is going to be very specific. Initially, I will finish all the aspects of, the classification of animal behavior and so on. But this is not the way in which you will be seeing animals behaving when you venture into the fields. And being extremely conscious about the ethics in photography and in wildlife, what I have done is, after I have shared some of the points with you, I have kept many of my videos ready to show them to you. I don't want to conduct this talk with static pictures. I want to show you videos because when you go into the field, you will be watching plants, insects, animals in the form of the videos that you will see. So I don't boast of having the best quality videos because these videos, some of them are even 20 years old. But what they help us in understanding is how we can go about on our nature trails, on our bird watching sessions, looking at various aspects of animal behavior. So let me start with it. The first word that I want you to get introduced to is adaptations. Basically, adaptations, we all know, are changes, modifications, adjustments which plants and animals make, organisms make. Wherever they are living, whichever environment they are living in, they want to modify their structure, they want to modify something in their body so that they can suit the environment better. These adaptations basically are of three types. One is structural. Structural can be either external structure, which is called morphology, or internal structure, which is called anatomy. The second type of adaptations are physiological adaptations, that is the internal working mechanism, how the heart functions, how the skin functions, how the liver functions, how your brain functions. That's all about physiology. And the third adaptation, which we are going to focus on today, is the behavioral adaptation. Animal behavior, and later on I will also end with a little bit of plant behavior also. Animal behavior is a type of adaptation. Adaptations are certain changes which are necessary for the animal to survive. Look at the definition which I've written on the top here. It allows the organism to survive, which means no animal behaves if there is no value to it, if there is no survival value to it, if there is no way that the animal is going to benefit out of it, then they will not accept, they will not do those adaptations. So they will not behave in that particular manner. I will immediately point out at play. Many otters, many animals like cetaceans, dolphins, and so on, they are known to play. And scientists initially were thinking that, what is the use of playing? And then they realized that play is a behavior which helps in bonding, which helps in establishing social structure, social connection, so that if there is any danger, if there is any threat from outside, then individuals in a society can work together and can help each and every individual to escape from predator. Let's again look at basic. You might feel, of course, there are textbook definitions of what is behavior. Anything which an animal does. But I would say that there is some change in this. It's not necessary that the animal does something. It's not necessary an action. For example, when you're visiting a grassland or when you're going to the reeds of a waterbed, you might see bitterns. When you approach or when a predator approaches, it just throws its head up in the air with the body straight, with the beak pointing to the sky, and it totally becomes motionless. It's absolutely motionless. Now, this is no action, you might say, but this is behavior. You might also know about animals pretending to be dead. It's called feigning death. Feigning, pretending to be dead, which means as soon as they see a predator, as soon as they see a human being, they will stop its movement. They will just pretend as if it's dead. You might say there is no movement, so there is no behavior, but that's wrong. Even that is a behavior, pretending to be dead. So what is behavior? Basically, it's a response to a stimulus. And what is a stimulus? Stimulus is any physical, chemical, electromagnetic change in the environment. The environment can be outside. The environment can also be inside. For example, when your stomach starts rumbling, when you have acidity in your stomach, when you're hungry, that's internal change, a change inside the environment of the stomach. So internal environment is changed. And because of that hunger pangs, animals also go out to hunt. So stimulus is something which is present at all points of time. These are changes which are happening outside or inside. And based on that, the animal needs to behave. The first category of behavior is what is called as instinct. Instinct, very few of them, fortunately, are present in human beings. And the opposite of instinct or instinctive behavior or innate behavior or inborn behavior, these mean the same. The opposite of that is learned behavior, the behavior which you acquire during your life's process. So what is an instinct? Instinct, most animals, they behave because of instinct. They are born with that. When a bird, like a lapwing, gives rise to chicks, the young ones which come out, they know right from the beginning that if there is a behavior overhead, they have to crouch and they have to become motionless. Nobody teaches them. It's by birth that they know that they have to do that. I will refrain from giving human examples all the time, but in some cases, I may be forced to give human examples. So a baby, human baby, is born with the instinct to smile when they see eyes and suckle the milk from the mother. Nobody teaches it. The third behavior that you might have noticed in case you've played with babies is the fist fingers close as soon as you give even a single finger or a branch or a play toy in the hand. That's an instinct. They want to protect themselves from falling. That's why they grip the hands closed and close the fist so that they can catch. That is instinct. So instinct, most animals show a lot of instinctive behavior. It is usually genetic. Many people ask me, so how are instincts produced? How is it that the animals are born with it? And the first answer that I give is that it is inborn, it is genetic. It is because the animal's genes are coded with this kind of a behavior. So immediately the next question is asked. Incidentally, I'm sorry, you can ask questions, but you will have to type your questions and keep it in the text box. And at the end of my lecture, my talk, my discussion, Kavi or any one of the facilitators will look at that and will ask these questions at the end, so that I don't miss out any points. That's the reason. Okay, coming back. So instincts are genetic. So the question asked is, How did the behavior become encoded in the DNA? For this, I'll need to give you an example. Very interesting it is. Coming back to the lapwings, let's say the red wattle lapwing. Let's say millions of years ago, the young ones which were born had a 50-50% chance of behaving. 50% of the young ones ran across when they saw a predator overhead, and 50% of them crouched. Those which ran, the action was observed by the predator, they got caught, they died. Those which crouched, they merged with the background, they looked like the substratum, and so they escaped from the predator. Slowly, from 50%, it became 60%, it became 80%, until and unless all those individuals which had the inherent capacity of running when they saw a predator, they got eliminated. Ultimately, what happened is only those individuals remained which had the behavior of crouching, being motionless, and thereby not being detected by the predator. So now you have 100% individuals. It takes hundreds of years, mind you, because behavior is influenced by DNA. Our behavior is also influenced by DNA. Animal behavior is also influenced by DNA. So what happens is most of the instincts are remaining, are encoded in the DNA, and they behave like that. Some of the behaviors which are acquired by the animals are learned behavior. I will come to that second category later on. Let's finish with instinct. So these are unlearned and they are triggered by the environment. Okay, examples, there are several, like specific and directional movement of the animals. It's called taxis or migration. You all know very well that by December, January, flamingos migrate from Gujarat to Shivri and to all Airoli and several other places in Mumbai. And even the young ones are there. And many a times the young ones are leading the trail. They are leading the migration. And that's because they are born and they know in their brain that they have to fly in the southeasterly direction. So approximately they know the direction, but the finer details of where to land and what to do is guided by the adults. So migration, I've written here prehistoric and annual. What is prehistoric migration? Prehistoric migration means what happened during the course of evolution of the earth. I would like to give you one example. Tigers have migrated from Siberia. I think this is the best example that I can give. Tigers have migrated from Siberia into India. They came in from the northeast frontier. They entered from the northeastern side. Once they entered, and as their population kept on expanding, increasing and so on, their range started expanding. They moved outwards into the subcontinent of India, moving westwards, southwestwards and southwards. Now, since they had come in from Siberia, their adaptation in that cold environment led them to have hairy, furry skin. Hairy, furry skin in Siberia is extremely useful for them to survive in the cold climate. Now, having been adapted to have fur around them, once they came into India, they could not have shed off that fur. So what they do is they have changed now their behavior. What they do now is when it gets too hot, they have to enter into water puddles or collections of water like a tank or lake or river, anywhere, and they have to cool their body because they cannot shed the hair during the summer months. So this is a very good example of how adaptations are present, but because this migration was prehistoric, and since these animals cannot now go back, they have remained here and they have got adapted, but because structural adaptations are not there, they have modified their behavior. So prehistoric behaviors are there which they cannot go back, like the mass migration between North America and South America and vice versa and so on. So that's prehistoric movement. Annual migration and seasonal migration and vertical migration. Vertical migration happens in the sea where the phytoplankton and the zooplankton keep on moving up and down. Annual migration happens with birds, and there's a whole lot of talk that can be given about birds and bird migration. Signals and communications, I'm going to talk about it in more detail. That is instinct. Now let's look at learned behavior. When an animal learns in the very initial, very, very sensitive time of the animal's life, then that is called as imprinting. Imprinting means a behavior which the animal learns and it becomes a part of its regular behavior and it does not forget in its entire life. That's imprinting. It has to happen in the initial, in the very, very primitive stages of life. And one of the best scientists who studied this behavior and who has written theories about this imprinting is Konrad Lorenz. And his example and his experiment is very well known. He had kept some eggs of geese for artificial incubation, and when the young ones came out, the first thing moving that they saw in front of their eyes was a scientist, Konrad Lorenz. And so these young ones followed the scientists everywhere. So what happened was they imprinted the appearance of the scientist as their mother, as their own species, and that's what continued for the rest of the life. So this is called imprinting. Second form of learning is associative learning. It's called classical conditioning. Many of you might have heard of Pavlov's dog. What is classical conditioning? Two separate incidences are connected together. And what is that? Mind you, I'm going to talk a little bit about conditioning of our own mind and how human beings are suffering these days because of conditioning of our mind. Pavlov's dog, you know about it. When the scientist kept a bell and he tied a dog and he offered the food, every time the food was offered, the bell was sounded, the dog associated two independent events, the ringing of the dog and the appearance of the food, as two associated events, or his brain got conditioned that every time the bell rang, the food appeared. And this is how the dog salivated. And later on, even though there was no food, by just ringing of the bell, the dog thought that the food is going to appear, so it started salivating. This is called classical conditioning. This is based on Pavlov's experiment with his dog and salivation. There's another kind of conditioning which is called operant conditioning. It's called trial and error. Again, something which we all do in our lives. You all must have been subjected to trial and error by your own parents. I will first tell you what the experiment was done by the scientist named Skinner. What he did was he placed a box, and in that box he placed mice, and he made some tunnels and he made some doors. In those tunnels or doors where the scientist wanted these mice to enter, he offered food. And in those tunnels where the scientist did not want the mice to enter, he placed a mild shock. Slowly, by trial and error, the mice learned which tunnels to enter and which not, because every time they entered a wrong tunnel, they were punished. I'm sure you all know that right from your birth, your parents have always given you something as a prize or a reward and something as a punishment. When you do something good, you are given a reward or a prize or a chocolate or some gift. And when you do something bad or wrong, which the society does not want or your parents are not very happy that you're doing, then you get a punishment. Go back to animal behavior. We all know that the Sundarbans tigers used to attack the villagers, the fishermen and the fisher folk. And so what the forest department did was they placed boats with dummies of fishermen, and then they placed a shock on that boat, a high battery power shock. So whenever the tigers used to approach and put their paw at the ridge or the edge of the boat, they used to get a shock. And through that, initially, I'm saying initially, the tigers learned that if you approach or put your paw on the boat of this fisherman, you will get a shock. But later on, what happened, when not many of these boats were present, and when they got the meal of a fisherman, they again started hunting the fishermen from their boats. So this is called trial and error, Skinner's box, operant conditioning. It's a French word and it comes from that. Another way of learning that we all know is called habituation. I'm sure all of you know that slowly your parents shouting has no effect on you because you are so engrossed in your mobile phones or your computers that you get habituated of your parents in the background, and that therefore becomes, you can say, inexistent or non-existent. So what is habituation? When continuously you're faced with some stimulus, and if that stimulus does not have any effect or is ineffective on you, then slowly that stimulus does not generate a response. It's like when you enter a room, you heard the tick tock, you hear the tick tock of a clock, but very soon that tick tock becomes absolutely, you become innocent, or I'm sorry, ignorant about the tick tock, because you get so used to it that you start avoiding any reaction to the tick tock of the clock. This happens a lot in animals. Imagine when animals are moving around and they're, for example, animals like social animals like deer and so on. When they are moving around, they are hearing the snapping of the twigs on the ground. They're listening to the grass blades. They're listening to the swaying of the grasses. They're listening to other birds. Several other sounds are present in the environment. But suddenly, there is an alarm call by some animal, like a langur or a deer giving an alarm call. At that time, the deer are totally habituated to the other sounds of nature, so they have no effect on them. But when there is an alarm call, then they can immediately gauge that there's a predator around, and that's how they can come to know about the presence and escape. One very complex way is the last way, that is called insight learning. It's seen very often in primates and monkeys, apes, including human beings. What is insight learning? Using previous experiences and learning to solve new, hitherto unknown examples, or you can say conditions of nature or stimuli. I'll give you an example. We all learn throughout our life. We all learn math, we all learn analysis, but when somebody gives us a new problem, we apply different aspects of our learning to solve a new problem. The best example given is when some chimpanzees were confined in a room. They were given bananas. They ate the bananas. These were young chimpanzees. They had never eaten bananas. So when they ate the bananas, they found that bananas were very tasty. In another room, these same young chimpanzees were given boxes, and so they could put boxes one on top of the other and climb up. Now, in the third room, they kept boxes in the at the corner of the room, and they hung bananas from the top. What these chimpanzees did, they knew that by climbing on the boxes, they could gain height, and by looking at bananas, they knew that they were very tasty. Now, two separate learning was used to solve a hitherto unknown condition, a new condition, and so they put these boxes one on top of the other. They gained height and they reached the bananas and ate them. So this is insight learning. It's very well prevalent amongst human beings, complex amongst chimpanzees, apes, and so on and so forth. Now, these are some other aspects of ecological aspects of behavior. What do you mean by that? So animals consciously select their habitat. If an animal is living in the forest, then the animal gets adapted and selects the forest as its habitat by consciously behaving in that fashion. So animals first move into the forest, they get attuned to it, they get used to it, they get used to the animals which are present in the forest conditions. They look at the plant species which are available for them to forage upon, for them to eat. If they are herbivorous, if they are predators, they look at animals which they can feed upon, and so on. So for every habitat, while selecting, when the first time these animals enter into a new habitat, they have to select the habitat by modifying their behavior. You will say that, oh, an animal will not enter into a grassland if the animal cannot tolerate temperature. But this is what is happening at every moment in the course of evolution. An animal has to be adapted to evolve, and an animal needs to evolve and then get adapted. So adaptation and evolution is a cycle by itself. Every time an animal evolves, becomes into new species or diversifies into new species, by becoming that, it starts getting adapted. We call it specialized. Okay. And by becoming specialized, they become more and more and more adapted to that habitat, to that environment, to those conditions which are prevailing. So evolution leads to adaptation, and adaptation leads to evolution. Food selection. When you say an animal is herbivorous, it first needs the kind of teeth to be able to chew, and only then it can nibble at grasses, it can nibble at overhanging branches. So based on that, even within herbivory, the animal may be, we say, browser or grazer. What is a grazer? Grazer is an animal which can take rooted vegetation like a horse and feed on them. Browser means an animal takes overhanging branches and feeds on them. In carnivory, you have several different examples. I'm just going to give you the basics of classification because each one is a book by itself. So we can't go into the details in 1 hour itself. In carnivory, you can have insectivorous animals, you have flesh eaters, you have so many different kinds of animals which are there. Okay. Aggression. Why do animals become aggressive? That's because there is competition. What is competition? When a resource is limited, animals need to take advantage of the available resources, and because the resources are limited, every animal needs to reach, needs to approach, needs to take the advantage of those resources, and because of that, there is competition. In biology, we say competitors cannot coexist. So if in a habitat you see different species of birds, each bird will have different size of beak, will have different kinds of animals or plants or fruits or flowers that they feed upon, which means they avoid competition. So we say competitors cannot coexist, which means if they are found in the same habitat, if they are found in the same geographical location, it means that they are avoiding competition by behaving in a certain manner, and that behavior is because they have adaptation. So a bird with a longer beak will feed on animals, let's say on a shore, which are at greater depth. So if you look at a whimbrel or a curlew feeding on a beach, then they will be able to access worms or clams which are at a much greater depth as compared to a stint or a plover or a sandpiper and so on. Both of them are present in the same place. They're avoiding competition. They're avoiding to have any aggression, because competition, if it is there, then the animals have to be aggressive. So why is aggression? Aggression is because they want to tell each other that I am more superior by showing anger. If there is anger, then there are only two options. Either the animal has to die because the other one will overpower, or the second animal has to retreat. What is the meaning? They will have to move from that place to another place. So that is why we say competitors cannot coexist. Homing facility. What is homing? Homing means the animal starts recognizing its place, its area. And this is done by, you won't believe it, the term used is loafing around. What is loafing? Loafing means generally moving around so that the animal becomes familiar. Why does the animal need to be familiar about its own geographical terrain? Because at the last moment, it cannot search for places to hide. It cannot search for where to give birth to young ones. It cannot search for where is the best possible food available. It cannot search for where to establish a new territory, and so on and so forth. So familiarity is extremely important for animals so that they can come to know what options are available in the geographical terrain that the animal occupies. What is the difference between homing and territoriality? A territory is a much narrow, restricted area as compared to the home range of the animal. So what is the difference? The home range is what the animal is familiar about. The territory is what the animal actively and vehemently, forcefully defends. How does it defend? In birds, they will give out calls telling, oh, this is my area, don't come close by. Or in tigers, it can be a fight. In mammals, it can be a fight. In other animals, they can spray urine or they can spray some kind of chemicals around telling that this is my area, don't come inside. So they are kind of leaving their identity cards in the territory. So what is territory? Territory is something, an area that an animal is actively defending. Why does an animal need territory? Because in the territory, the animal will get all the possible resources that are easily and quickly available. What are they? Food, water, shelter, interspersion. Interspersion means spreading or dispersal of the resources. And the fifth resource, which is very important, available in the territory is mates. So food, water, shelter, interspersion, and mates, these are all present as resources very easily available in the territory. Dispersal, what is dispersal? Spreading of the organism, spreading of the species from the hitherto available distribution map to a newer geographical area, expanding their distribution. It is an irreversible e-migration. E-migration means moving from one place to another. Why is it irreversible? It is irreversible because it's not just migration which happens annually or seasonally and so on, where an animal moves at one time and comes back. Here it is irreversible, and this is dispersal. Because in dispersal, when the reproduction rate is very high, when there is too much of competition, why is there competition? Because the resources are limited. So I'm going in a logical fashion. Because of reproduction, there are too many animals. Because of the resources being limited, the animals now need to venture out, move out of the home range. And when they move out, it has to be an irreversible e-migration, moving out. And when that happens, the animal's distribution increases and the range, the geographical range of the animal also increases. So this is all because of reproduction. The next aspect of animal behavior is communication. Extremely interesting. We can spend hours and hours and hours on that. Chemical communication. So animals have physical, which is visual, light, audio signals, or chemical communication. Okay. So chemical communication, you might have seen ants which walk in lines because they leave formic acid behind. As a child, I remember always I used to do this play, imagining a line that the ants are walking in. If there's a gap between them, you imagine that you're rubbing the place with your hand, and what actually you're doing is you're erasing within inverted commas, you're erasing or removing the formic acid. So the ants become confused at the beginning and end of that erasing part. And so because they cannot detect the formic acid, which is a line in which these ants are walking. Pheromones, there are so many examples. Insects use pheromones, mammals use pheromones. What are pheromones? Pheromones are chemical substances which are liberated by individuals of the opposite sex so that they can attract each other. So males release pheromones or females release pheromones with which the individuals of the opposite sex can be attracted to each other. And because see, the problem is that in many or most, I would say, animals, the breeding season is very short. And that breeding season cannot be spent in just locating each other. You know, animals don't sing songs. Every animal does not sing songs. So if they don't sing songs, they have to liberate chemicals, and insects can recognize and know about these pheromones over a distance of 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, and so on. So they can come to know that there is a female with which it needs to mate. Same way with tigers, same way with other cat species and so on. So they liberate it in the air so that the other individuals come to know about the presence of a breeding female in the territory. Visual signal, I've already talked about aggression. Courtship. In science, in biology, we say every action which results in mating is courtship. Every action, everything that animals do before mating, all that is courtship. So there are courtship displays. What are courtship displays? These are elaborate visual treat to the eye, whereby it is very species specific, and the animal needs to do that to win the attention of the female and to make the female ready for mating. Very important. In those animals where there is an elaborate courtship, unless and until the courtship is conducted, unless and until the courtship is carried out, it has been found that the pituitary gland does not secrete the hormones which result in laying of the eggs. I would like to give this example, which is a very world famous example. The director of International Crane Foundation, George Archibald, Dr. George Archibald, put in a garb of the whooping crane and danced in front of the female crane so that the female crane could release through the pituitary gland the hormones which resulted in laying eggs. Why? Because if this dance would not have been there, then the female would not be ready to mate. So in most of the animals where there's an elaborate courtship dance, that courtship dance is basically to make the female ready for mating. If there is no courtship dance, the female will not mate. Simple. Another form of biological communication is using light. You might have seen fireflies giving rise to the frequency and the emission of light which attracts the individuals from far away. The kind of light and the frequency of light will tell it is species specific. Not only that, you know about bioluminescent fungi, you know about bioluminescent noctiluca. These are small phytoplankton which are present in the seas, and because of that they concentrate in areas in the warm seas, and they can just all come together maybe before the lunar cycle starts, and that's how they come there and they get attracted. It's one of the reasons why why organisms gather together, maybe to have a kind of a congregation so that they can get escape from predators, or they can also help in breeding. All these are some of the interesting inquiries which scientific communities are delving into. Audio signal, several forms. One is contact notes. You know about babblers. When they move around, like the jungle babbler, they move around and they give contact notes to tell each other about their presence. So it's like telling that, hello, I'm here, where are you? So they help the flock to remain together. That's what is contact notes. If there's a loose flock, they can stay together. So these are calls, and there's an entire book by I'm forgetting the name, Aubrey Manning, called Bird Calls and Their Meaning. And each bird call is classified into different category: contact notes, aggression calls, courtship calls, territorial calls, mimicry. All these are audio signals which birds use, including, of course, cautionary calls, that is warning signals which are there. Okay. So these are audio signals which are used by birds, mammals, and so on. And these bird songs are extremely species specific. Here I would like to remind you that in many places in the world, people use these specific songs to play by audio playbacks, which we are totally against, and that should not be used by people as a playback for attracting birds and to see these specific birds, but these are species specific, yes. And the last part in communication is about language. What is language? It is a communication which has got a vocabulary. So what do you mean by a vocabulary? Vocabulary means actions which are more complex than just simple actions. Like, for example, in the bees, you have this waggle dance, and during the waggle dance, the worker bee comes back to the hive, first orients its dance to the direction of the sun, to the angle of the sun, and then orients the dance towards the source of the honey or the food or the pollen grain. And this is how honeybees workers tell other worker honeybees the source and the direction and the proximity of the food that can be easily visited by the rest of the honeybees. So this is a fantastic way of communication. And of course, the best form of communication is found in primates, that is monkeys, apes, and human beings. And then there are interspecific associations which result in specific behaviors. For example, prey and predator. If a prey wants to hide, then it should know what is hiding behavior. It has to be absolutely motionless when a predator comes close by. And similarly, the predator also needs to know unobtrusive behavior. Unobtrusive means what cannot be detected. And that's how the predators can actually approach the prey. Of course, today, if you say that the predator is alive, it means that the predator has been successful. It means that in spite of the prey trying to hide, the predator is being able to overcome, overpower, and thereby get the necessary food. So the predator and the prey, it's a continuous cycle of events. It's a continuous cycle of nature. The prey tries to become more and more adapted to escape from the predator. On the other hand, the predator becomes more and more adapted to be able to capture the prey. And this is a vicious cycle. But both of them are successful. And this we know because both of them are present in large numbers. Of course, the prey has to be much more than the predator. Commensalism means two organisms living together without affecting each other, like the hermit crab and the sea anemone, if they don't affect each other, or the parasites, I wouldn't say parasites, commensals which are found in the gut of the cockroach, or in our case, and so on. So these are commensalisms. Interspecific association which does not benefit nor harm both the species. Opposite is mutualism, in which both the species are benefited. Here we know several examples like lichens and so on, or a mutualistic relationship in which benefit is to each other, like the spotted deer and langur, where they stay together so that alarm calls can be given by each of them, and that warns each other of the presence of predator. The langur can see from a height if it can see the predator approaching. The spotted deer can see from the ground level if the predator is approaching. There are instances when either of them may escape the presence of the predator, and by being together, by feeding each other, they are helpful to each other, and therefore it's a mutual relationship. Host-parasite, this is a behavior seen between the host and the parasite. Once again, like the prey and the predator, both the host and the parasite, since they are alive together, both of them have been extremely adaptive. They have been able to survive, and therefore, but the important thing is that the parasite will never exterminate the host, because we have a saying in Hindi, jis thali mein khata hai usi mein ched karta hai. I'm sorry, I'm using the Hindi proverb, but an animal which wants to continuously survive on the host cannot kill the host totally. So the parasite will keep at least a few of the host species alive, so that the parasite will also never ever become extinct. This is the rule of nature, and we all know about it. One more behavior, social behavior. Living together, not aggression. Please see the word, it's aggregation. Aggression is anger. Aggregation means living together. Several animals live together. We call it as animal society. You see herds of elephants, you see primates, you see deer, you see several animals which live together. The advantage is, of course, much more. And what is that? Although there is competition, because the grass amount and the habitat is a natural resource, so it's limited. But by staying together, there are more eyes looking out for the predator, and therefore there is a definite benefit of staying together. Advantages of a society are much more than the disadvantages, and that's why many animals resort to a behavior that is social behavior. Flocks and birds, birds of a feather flock together, same as a society. You know about bowerbirds or weaver birds, they all are found together so that they can attack a predator, which is a common enemy, all of them together. We all know when you see a owl in a city, all the crows, mynas, bulbuls, everybody gathers together interspecifically, and they all attack the common enemy, and that is the owl. So these are flocks of birds. They can be interspecific or intraspecific. Herding in mammals, when you say flocks in birds, then that is aggregation. The term used in mammals is herding, okay? And there are, of course, advantages, as I said. Altruism. Excuse me. Just let me have a little bit of water. You might have heard this word, altruism. By definition, altruism means sacrificing one's own life for the benefit of the entire species. A worker honeybee, in case there is any intruder, attacks the intruder, stings the intruder, and the sting, since the sting is a part of the abdomen, a part of the body of the honeybee, the sting gets embedded in the intruder, in the predator, and when the honeybee falls off, the sting is lost, the worker bee dies. By dying, the honeybee worker has sacrificed its own life to protect, to safeguard the interest of the entire beehive, or you can say the entire species. This is called altruism. It's seen in several animals. Social organization in insects, you must have heard about harvester ants, about chromatogaster, that is the ants which live in a colony in the trees, and several species of insects which live together. Colonial spiders, they are not insects, but they also show a social organization. And then when the organization, when the society becomes more complex, then what we have is a hierarchy. What is a hierarchy? In a social organization, when there are individuals at different levels, each individual of a lower level belongs to a different rank, and individuals of the lower rank have to show their subordination to individuals of the higher rank. The reason is very simple. The individuals of the higher rank are known to give protection to the entire group. It might be because they are extremely talented, they might be extremely very strong, and so on. Like for example, in langurs, the alpha male is the leader, he belongs to the highest rank, and all the other individuals are subordinate. They have to show the hierarchy. Just as in the army, the individuals of the lower rank salute the individuals of the higher rank. In the same way, in primates, in monkeys, they have appeasement behavior. Appeasement means showing their subordination by showing the butt or by lying down and showing their belly. It's like succumbing. It's like giving themselves up. You might have seen in dogs, when a dog starts barking, if you see the other dog giving its belly up and totally giving himself up to the other dog, it means that, boss, you are the boss. I don't want to do any panga. I don't want to have any kind of aggression with you. I fully understand that I am not able to fight with you. Why do animals have this hierarchy? A, because they want to avoid aggression at all time. Aggression is energy deficient. Is energy expenditure. By aggressive behavior, the animal is going to spend energy. So to stop them from spending very important energy, they don't want to have aggression. And by doing so, they respect the individuals of the higher rank, and thereby they are going to avoid the aggression. You might think that plant behavior is only restricted to what you study in school. Mimosa pudica, the touch me not. When you touch it, the leaves close. Or rain tree, every evening the leaves fold. That's all that you might have heard of. But actually speaking, every plant is behaving. As a seed, the plant has the option whether it should behave as a herb, show stunted growth, or it should behave like a shrub, or it should grow prostrate on the ground when it is called creeper, or it should start using other support means and climb up when it's called climber, or it should become a tree. This is called plant behavior. And since we are on the topic of animal behavior, I'm not going into more details, but plant behavior is itself a very interesting topic which you might see as you go in nature trails and so on. So I would like to end the text matter before I start with the videos, that adaptations lead to evolution. What does it mean? When an animal is adapted to go and venture into grasslands, only then it can enter into grasslands. So it needs to have pre-adaptations to go into a grassland. When it enters into the grassland, it becomes specific, it becomes adapted, it gets specialized to living in the grassland. Now it starts evolving. What I'm talking about is about millions of years of evolution. I'm not talking about few generations, I'm talking about millions of years. So these in evolution are called pre-adaptations. Pre-adaptations help animals to survive in a new habitat. When they come into a new habitat, they start becoming modified. They start getting adapted to the new habitat. They start becoming specialized. So when you see an animal in a grassland or when you see an animal in a forest, you can imagine millions of years ago, they were not animals of the forest, but they came into the forest, they got adapted to the forest life, and now they have become adapted to the forest. Now you can say they have become specialized for living only in the forest. Some animals may not become specialized, in which case they can move from forest to grassland or from forest to open areas and so on. These animals are called generalized. So in adaptations and in behavior, we use these two terms, generalized and specialized. They are opposites. So behavior is one such adaptation. And when you go into the field, look at an animal as a sum total, as a bag of adaptations. Don't stop by naming the animal. Look at all the possible types of behavior that I've talked initially and given you all this classification and types. Look at these behaviors, whether it is feeding behavior, nesting behavior, hygiene. What is hygiene? In birds, it can be preening, it can be anting, it can be dust bathing. All these are hygiene, to be able to manage its own body and to be able to keep itself clean. Fur in animals is also maintained by hygiene behavior. So these are behaviors which you will see all the time. And with these behaviors, once you start looking at them, an animal will not remain just the name, but it will become an animal that is because of millions of years of evolution. So when you look, you will understand that how this animal has come up here and how it has been able to stay here. What I'll do now is quickly start with some of the videos. They are very short clips. I would like you to look at these videos. Oh, yeah. Are you able to see, or the video is too high, too heavy to play?
We can see your screen, but like,
Oh,
have you started the video though?
yeah, the video has started, but
No, no.
uh,
You'll have to then share your screen, share your entire desktop.
yeah, 1 second, I'll just
Then
do
we'll be
that.
able to view it. Yeah.
Mm, yeah. So here you can see the flamingos feeding. You can see the feeding behavior. They're using the well-adapted beak for filtering all the kind of food stuff that they can get from the aquatic habitat. And you can see the young flamingos as well. This should bring a question in your mind that how come the young and the adults are together? What is it that has resulted in them in different phases being present in the same place, in the same area? Okay. This is a pill bug or a pill millipede. And this is, first of all, it starts showing as if it's dead. So this is called feigning death. And once they are, uh, oh, where I've taken this, oh my God, they are all over the world. They are all over India. And it will be difficult for me to tell you from where I've taken. But some of them I remember. This is from the forest in Dandeli forest. And you can see how slowly, when they are comfortable and when they feel that the predator or the intruder is gone away, then they start relaxing their body and they will come out of the shell, which is why they're called pill millipede or pill bug. And slowly they will start walking and moving away. Being arthropods, they have chitinous body. So they have a kind of like an armadillo, like an anteater. They can roll themselves in the form of a ball. So I always say that an animal having the adaptation is useless if it does not behave. I'll give you an example. A green grasshopper must go and sit on a green leaf. If the green grasshopper goes and sits on the brown bark of the tree, then mind the words that I'm saying, it has got camouflage morphology, but it is not using camouflage behavior. So it has got cryptic morphology. Cryptic means hiding. It has got cryptic color, but it is not behaving in a cryptic fashion. I repeat my example. A green grasshopper must go and sit on a green substratum. Only then it can help to camouflage the animal. So here you can see redshanks as they move around. They are using the currents. You will see them when they walk. Many of these birds, they use their feet to rake up the mud, to churn up the mud, and that helps them to disturb the prey which is in the mud, and then they feed on them. The wading behavior is because of the long legs, but then they have to go and wade in water. Wade means we need to know and understand the meaning of the word. We use the word wading. Wading means walking through the water without actually lifting the legs, dragging your feet in the water. That is wading. So waders use this technique for, of course, you can recognize this Tibetan wild asses in Ladakh, herbivory, hoofed mammals. I mean, I can talk for half an hour at least on each video, but I'm sorry, there is not much time like that. So these are ungulates. Ungulates are hoofed mammals. And because they have hoofs, they need to have trotting. So every animal, the movement itself has got different kinds of movement. So you have plantigrade locomotion. What is plantigrade locomotion? It's found in bears, where the entire sole of the feet is applied to the ground, plantigrade. It's a technical word, but applying, in common terms, I would say applying the entire sole, S-O-L-E, to the ground. Second kind of locomotion is using digits. In biology, it's called digitigrade, like tigers, dogs, in general, cats. What is that? Putting the digits means fingers, on the ground. So there is a second form of locomotion. Third form of locomotion is unguligrade. Unguligrade means unguis. Unguis means nothing but the last part of the toe, which we call as hoof. So this is trotting, galloping, running. All this is possible only when animals have hoofs. Donkeys, horse, pigs, rhino, buffalo, sheep, cow, all these are unguligrades. They have to run on hard ground. You can't hear the call. Actually, the lapwing is giving its territorial call. But I'm sure you've seen lapwing adults. If you approach the nest, then the mother lapwing goes away from the nest and gives what is called as a broken wing display. What is broken wing display? The parent behaves as if it is having an injury. Why? Because the predator's attention will go to the adult rather than towards the eggs. At that time, the parent is specifically trying to safeguard the eggs, because once the predator comes closer to the adult bird, it will fly away. So this is a technique used by many, many plovers. In general, in common terms, it's called broken wing display. Broken wing. Remember that. So you will see that. Once again, Ladakh and gulls. I wanted to show this because it literally burns my heart when I see my own relatives. I'm sorry to say, my own relatives means Gujaratis, in several parts of the world, including in Ladakh, feeding gulls, terns at Haji Ali, in Ladakh, in Gujarat, and Nal Sarovar, wherever you go, with gathias, jalebis, theplas, and everything. Please tell them that they are not supposed to be getting all this kind of food. But what I wanted to show with this is about the adaptation and the behavior. Gulls can swim in water, terns cannot. Because gulls can swim, for terns, they need a stationary, like a log of wood or an island or surrounding parapets and so on for resting. So this is how, again, the correlation between adaptation and behavior that you see. So you might have seen butterflies and the proboscis as it comes out. Now, the proboscis is basically a kind of a siphon. And this siphon is used for a variety of food stuff. You can see butterflies. Some of the butterflies, you can see them, it's called mud puddling. They take the salts from the mud. Some of the butterflies, in fact, the most gorgeous butterflies feed on dung. It's unbelievable. They feed on poop. They feed on fecal matter. And this is quite surprising for us. But otherwise, they are taking the benefit, the advantage of the organic matter, which is undigested food, in this poop. And that's how they feed on them. But then the butterflies need to fly from one source to another using their proboscis, which is folded below their head in a coiled fashion, in a spring-like fashion. So it's like a watch spring which coils underneath, and they have to do that. And what about a leech? So leeches have sensory organs on their skin with which they can make out the temperature difference. And what is the meaning? They come to know about the presence of furred animals, warm body, warm-blooded animals. And with that, they remain on grass, grass blades, and so on. And when a mammal is moving around, they get attached to it. In the saliva of the leech, they have anticoagulatory substances. The term used is heparin, hirudin, which is similar to the heparin which is found in human beings. It's called hirudin in leeches. Heparin is found in human beings. So this hirudin is an anticoagulatory substance. It keeps the blood in liquid condition. They secrete that, and there's also a kind of a material in the saliva which rids you of pain. So you don't even come to know that a leech is biting you because of that. So very clever animals. Imagine how small they are, and yet they are totally adapted to live and survive in such a kind of an area. Spotted deer. You know, the skin of the spotted deer is spotted because they live in the interface of grass and trees. When the sunlight filters through the trees and falls on the ground, most mammals are colorblind except horses, primates. So tigers can't see colors, predators can't see colors. What they see are spots. So the spotted deer body hides in the background because the color cannot be seen, but the spots resemble the spots falling of the trees on the ground, and that is how the predator cannot see the spotted deer. Similarly, since the spotted deer is also colorblind and tigers move in grasses, the sunlight and the shadow caused by the movement of the grass resembles the stripes of the tiger. Believe me, when a tiger is in the grass and if there's the moving grass because of the grass swaying, even you will not be able to locate the presence of the tiger in the grass, because initially even you can't see the stripes of the tiger as different from the movement of the grass blades due to the breeze flowing through. Young ones. In a society, the young ones look at the backside of the tail. Each deer has got a specific pattern just behind, you can say, the buttocks or the loins of these animals, and that is what the young ones look at to follow the parents. So that's following the parents, or that's called social behavior. You can also call that as a behavior which helps them to survive in the society. In frogs, there is no actual mating behavior. There is no actual real mating. What they do is the male mounts on the female and it just does amplexes. Amplexes means a kind of a embracing. By embracing, the female is stimulated to, through the pituitary, lay the eggs. The female lays the eggs. The male spawns on them, liberates his sperms on them, and so the fertilization is external. So all this is a part of the breeding behavior, and this gives success to the animals by increasing their individuals, by increasing their numbers. This is a rare video for me. Praying mantis actually building the cocoon. The praying mantis female here is preparing a froth, and in the froth she gives her eggs. The froth then gets exposed to the air. The outside of the froth becomes like thermocol in its texture, and many a times you see these dry cocoons of the praying mantis. This part is the parental behavior, and here it ends. In reptiles, in frogs, in fishes, the parental behavior is only restricted to laying eggs and abandoning the eggs and leaving them at the mercy of nature. It's only in birds and mammals that you have elaborate, more complex parental behavior. So what is parental behavior? From the time the eggs hatch till the young one is capable of defending itself, all that is a part of parental behavior. Now, parental behavior can be a big investment for the animal. And if there are too many young ones, then the parents cannot exhibit parental behavior. So the intensity of the parental behavior is dependent on the number of young ones. It is indirectly proportional. More parental behavior in less number of offsprings. Less parental behavior in more number of offspring. So in birds and mammals, when they produce hardly 2, 3, 4 offspring. And because of that, they can afford to invest their energy in parental behavior. In birds, it can be a few days, can be a few months. In larger mammals, it can be a few years. In elephants, it can be many, many years. You see snails moving. Now, snails have got the habit of holding the entire ground, and that's because their feet are totally muscular from below. And because of these muscular feet, which release a kind of a sticky substance, it's a mucopolysaccharide, in our term only sticky mucus, and that release helps, as they say, snails can walk on the edge of a blade and still their feet will not get cut. Snails have two tentacles you can see in front. One of the tentacles are feelers, the ones which are below, and the tentacles which are above, upper tentacles, they have eyes at the tip, as you can see here. Okay. This tentacle has the eye. This is the eye of the snail. Okay. This tentacle is a feeler with which they can come to know about the ground. So because they have these feelers, their behavior is such that they have to always stick to the ground. Otherwise, the tentacles will be useless. I'm not going to show more of this. I'm sure at some point of time or the other, this is in Ranthambore, just at the entrance. The male showing off especially when the females appear, as you can see here. The females will appear from the right side. And the male is just trying to show off the best of the male. The most attractive male has been able to use its feathers, have enough time to preen its feathers and so on. Here you can see the female which has appeared. Okay, so this is a courtship behavior, and many animals indulge in that. Okay. Reptiles have to apply the entire body to the ground. That's why they're called reppers. Reptile means applying the entire belly to the ground. And this behavior is because the evolution of reptiles has made them have the belly in such a way that the limbs and the belly can only lift a little bit off the ground and then they can walk. Lizards are best at it. Crocodiles are very feeble. Snakes, because they don't have their limbs, they have to apply the entire body to the ground. Okay. Here you can also see the tongue being lashed out and used for a variety of functions. And then, of course, here is a wine snake. And many snakes have thermosensory apparatus. This wine snake has got very powerful eyes. Okay. And it has got sensory devices on its nostrils, because of which it can come to know the presence of prey species. All reptiles have, it's called kinetic jaw. Kinetic means moving jaw. They actually, like a sock being rolled over the feet, that's how the jaws move over the food, and they can actually gulp and literally move over the prey as the prey is being engulfed and devoured. Here you can see the wine snake using its habitat. This was in 2016 at Matheran. You can see the Karvi flowering, the mass flowering of Karvi at Panorama Point in Mahabaleshwar. Oh, sorry. Mammals have very little control on temperature. whatever control they have, they know fully well that they can get overheated. And when their body starts getting overheated, they can either sweat or they can pant. Birds cannot pant. So what birds do is they keep their beaks open and they flutter. But mammals have to pant. Here is a tiger which is keeping its jaw open and panting. The tongue has got highly vascular blood vessels, because of which it can lose heat. So if they don't do that, they can die by the body getting overheated. And this is what can be extremely dangerous for the animal to survive. Males in breeding season during courtship can attire themselves in colors. In birds, we call them breeding plumage. In animals, we call them courtship attire. Here's a garden lizard, Calotus versicolor, having this breeding attire, usually in the month of April, May, when the males are showing off, and that's what helps them to mate. This is because when they are moving around in trees, the male and the female should be able to attract each other. So that's why they need different colors. In the garden lizard, the males also have bobbing behavior. What is bobbing? They sway their head up and down so that the orange color looks like the fluttering of a flag in the air. Very interesting. So that's what the garden lizards do. There's a very tiny animal called antlion. Okay, it makes a pit on the ground. Look at the instinctive behavior. This is the larva of an animal which looks like a dragonfly, but the moment you keep it on the ground, it can only go in reverse direction. It has only the reverse gear. And why so? That's because it makes its pit in mud, in loose soil, and it can help the animal only moving backward. You can see the powerful jaws, because of which it can capture its prey, which is usually ants, and it can hold the prey in the pit and feed on it at leisure. This is Maya, the tigress, at Tadoba last year in February. You can see that she was hiding until the sambar came to know and see the ears, and her presence was revealed, and so the deer ran away. But I was watching this Maya almost for about half an hour, trying to lie down, crouch, remain there. Probably its attack was not really planned. Otherwise, she would have attacked when the sambar deer and its young ones were quite close by. But now you can see the pads, you can see the digitigrade locomotion, you can see the tail, you can see the back of the ears, which has these white patches, which are used by young ones, because when the young ones are following the female, they can only see the white in grass. So that's what they have to follow. Peacock I have already shown. I'll show you more of the feeding behavior. This was last year in Kaziranga. You can see the black neck stork feeding on fish. Oh. It's not playing. Yeah. So look at how it's trying to, see the way it's capturing the fish. Imagine that the eyes are well adapted to see both in air and in water. Otherwise, because of refraction, it would not have come to know the exact depth at which the fish are located, the fish are present. This is a fantastic adaptation found in storks, in kingfishers, and so on. Again in Tadoba, see the wild dogs. Many a times, many animals show. I will allow you first to see the video. It's called displacement behavior. What is displacement behavior? Actually, the wild dogs are supposed to have attacked either the wild boar or the sambar deer, which is behind. But because they can't attack, or because they are not in a mood to attack, they're doing something else. So what is displacement behavior? Displacement behavior means actually in response to the stimulus, rather than showing a particular response which is expected, they are doing something else. I'll give you an example. Among children, when you ask a question to somebody, you start scratching your head. Instead of giving the answer, you scratch your head. So scratching of the head becomes a displacement behavior that is not specific to the stimulus that you are responding. This is very interesting that I saw 2 years ago at Karnala. There was a collection of water, and the same thing happened this year. It seems in a society at Hiranandani. The monkeys, the bonnet macaque, they were going to a height and they were jumping. They were jumping into the water as if this was their own private swimming pool. What they were doing is they were jumping after climbing up the tree, going to a height, and each one was doing multiple number of times as if they had taken membership to the swimming pool, and the swimming pool is not going to last for a long time. Now imagine such a complex behavior which is seen, and can you see that fellow had got a stick with which it is holding it like a float, and it is moving to the edge of the pool. So very interesting behavior that is seen in monkeys, apes, and so on. When they want to show that they are alert, deers raise their tail. When I say deers, it means individuals of different species. So most deers, they have this raised up tail, and when you see that, you can be sure that the deer is alarmed, and that is the alarm signal. Here, I wanted to show you this because this is the warning coloration that is being shown by this blister beetle. If it is attacked, it will exude a brown colored liquid which causes formation of blisters on the intruder. So now the beetle is using its warning color and is showing off. So that showing off is showing its color, showing its pattern to show that this is a pattern, this is a color which is going to cause problem. So be away from that. And here once again, courtship behavior, as you can see in Great Crested Grebe. This is not from India, this is from Amsterdam. And they have an elaborate courtship behavior where they offer nesting material from one to another. Then they make the platform shaped nest. All that becomes a part of the breeding behavior, right from selection of mates, preparing the nest, laying the eggs, incubating the eggs, hatching out of the eggs, feeding of the females and the young ones. If it's a hornbill, then the male, which goes continuously over a month or so, feeding the female initially as she is incubating the eggs, or after the female has been able to hatch the eggs, she is now ready to come out, then feeding her until she is able to come out. All that becomes a part of the breeding cycle, breeding behavior, and it's a long drawn out behavior. We say breeding behavior just with a single word, but that breeding behavior starts right from the beginning till the end, and it may last for about a month or two in many animals, depending upon the complexity and the type of animal that it is. I think with that,
Thank you, Dr. Pandya, for that really interesting and detailed session. We have about 5 to 7 minutes to take questions. We have opened up the chat box, so if anybody has questions for Dr. Pandya, they can note them there and I'll ask them to him. Okay, we seem to have a first question already. The question's from Sunita, who's asking, why do birds bathe in the mud? Why do they take mud baths?
this is a part of their hygiene behavior. So a scientist who did research on sparrows who are doing mud bathing, what he did was he collected the soil sample before the mud bath and after the mud bath, and he found that after the mud bath the mud had ectoparasites, which are usually found at the base of the feathers of these sparrow. So mud bathing is actually a helpful behavior which helps them to get rid of parasites which are present outside. Now this is about birds. Let's talk about mammals. In elephants also do mud bathing. What they do is after a water bath, they take a mud bath because their tail is too short. So they can't make parasites which sit on the skin to be rid of. So what they're actually doing is that they're applying the mud outside like multani mati or like a pack of mud, like a face pack, and that helps them to keep parasites away from their body. So this is mud bathing in birds as hygiene, mud bathing in mammals like a hygiene.
Okay, we have another question.
Go ahead, shoot.
Which ethology books would you suggest to learn more about animal behavior?
Plenty. There is McFarland, there is Animal Behavior by British BBC. I would suggest the first thing for anybody to understand animal behavior is look at all the David Attenborough's series of Living Planet, Life on Earth, and so on. That's the best first to start. Because as a college student, I started seeing the 13 episode series of Life on Earth. And that's fabulous. That's literally fabulous. So there are, I mean, you just type animal behavior, you'll get a lot of them. But I prefer McFarland. It's a huge Bible of about 800 pages. And yeah, for bird behavior, I remember I had once given a talk on just on bird behavior, and it lasted for 3 hours. Just on bird behavior. So you can imagine the entire topic is extremely complex to deal with. And there are scores and scores and scores of examples that one can give. But because this talk is being recorded, I cannot use other photographers' photographs because I have to contact each one of them and get their permission to use. That's the reason all the videos that I showed were ones which I have shot.
Okay.
Yeah. Next question.
Misty is asking, how has being biped helped human evolution or human behaviors?
About 10 million years ago, ancestors of human beings and apes were common. Ramapithecus and Keniapithecus, this is 11 million year old fossil. They were the ancestors. They were living among trees. At that time, some of these individuals came on the ground and some remained in the trees. Those which remained in the trees evolved into apes of today. Those which came on the ground, they developed better bipedal locomotion. They started walking more on the ground, and these are the ones which resulted in the human beings. So about 10 million years ago, from a common ancestor, the two lines of evolution bifurcated. Those which stayed in the trees became apes of today. Those which came on the ground became human beings of today. And that evolution is not more than 5 million years old. So all the fossil history record of humans and their origins are 5 million, 4 million, 3 million, 2 million, 1 million, and that's how you come back in the line of evolution million years ago. So that's how you come. I hope I've answered your question. If there's something else that you wanted to ask. How is it helped? Now, imagine when you start walking on 2 feet, your first forelimbs, F-O-R-E, forelimbs. The first pair of limbs become free. When they become free, you don't need to walk with them. When you don't walk with them, you start using them for other things. When you start using them for other things, you start using them for manufacturing tools, for capturing prey. So the beginning of that is all manufacturing tools, predation, hunting, and gathering. So that's why human ancestors were hunters and gatherers.
Okay, we'll take one last question. This is from Chandan, who's asking, are there any simple methods to study or record behavior patterns of common animals which we see in our localities nearby?
Trust me, the maximum behavior studies have been done in the backyard of scientists. Whatever you see around you, record, observe, note down. It might turn out to be something very rare, very unique. Like it was a 14-year-old boy who saw that sand grouses consumed water like pigeon. And what is that? Usually birds, when they take the water into their beak, they have to throw their head backwards to gulp the water. But sand grouses and pigeons, they can roll their tongue in the form of a straw, and by doing that, they can suck water out. So this was discovered by a 14-year-old. So you can do a lot of studies around you, but for that, you need to know what is already discovered. So keep on reading, keep on noting down, keep on observing as much as possible in your own backyard. Someday you'll come up with something very strange which other people have not noticed, or if they have noticed, they have not reported. Mind you, anything which is verbal is not reported. Anything which is not reported is not known to the science.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Pandya. That was a very informative and fantastic talk. Thank you everyone else for joining in. Please join us tomorrow as well at 5 p.m. We have a talk by Vivek Tiwari, who's talking about a Delhi birder's journey from the Andes to the Amazon. So we're going to get an insight into the birds of the neotropics tomorrow. So see you all there tomorrow at 5 p.m.
Just a last instruction. If you have any more questions, you can post it either to the Delhi Birds group or to me on Facebook. Anything is welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
All the